Welcome back to the deep dive. We are undertaking a really profound and frankly necessary investigation today. We're focusing on a tradition, if you can call it that, which is so deeply entrenched, so politically protected, and just so brutally destructive. Its persistence, honestly, it defies belief, and this isn't happening in some hidden corner. It's flourishing right among the most powerful figures in Afghanistan.
It is a very dark subject, yes. And we're approaching it, with a commitment to really understanding it analytically. Our mission, using the sources we've gathered, articles, research, testimonies, is to move beyond just the shock factor. We want to genuinely understand the mechanics, the history, the economics, the crushing power structures that let this absolute tragedy continue.
We are diving deep into the culture known as Bacha Bazi. Now, the literal translation, Bacha Bazi, it's from Persian, right? It means boy play.
It does. And that name, boy play, it's chillingly misleading, isn't it? A euphemism, really. Because the documents we looked at, they just immediately shatter any idea of innocence. This isn't play. Not at all. It's institutionalized, systematic child sexual abuse, it's sexual servitude, it's prostitution, all rooted in this twisted display of male power and status.
Exactly. And if you, listening, are just learning about this now, or maybe you've heard the term, the big question is always the same, isn't it? How can a crime like this against children be perpetrated so openly, so blatantly? And why hasn't anything international efforts, local efforts, managed to stop it? So today, we're trying to answer that. We're going to dissect the sources that really lay bare the mechanisms behind this impunity.
Right, so let's start with defining precisely what we're talking about here, what this horror actually is. Bacha Bazi fundamentally involves the sale, the procurement, or sometimes the forceful kidnapping of young boys, usually prepubescent or adolescent, typically under 18. And they're taken for the sexual use and entertainment of powerful, wealthy men in Afghanistan.
And a central part of this, which is just awful, is the forced feminization of these boys. They're stripped of their identity right away. The reports detail how they're compelled to wear women's clothing, often bright, elaborate outfits, sometimes with bells or scarves, heavy makeup too, transforming them visually to fit whatever the abusers desire. It's not just abuse, it's like erasing who they are to make them more vulnerable.
And once they're prepared like that, they become performers.
Yeah.
They're sent to these exclusive private gatherings. And we're not talking about hidden backroom dens necessarily. These are parties attended by the Afghan elite, prominent warlords, powerful police commanders, high-ranking military officials, local gang leaders, the people with influence. The performance itself, it's usually dancing, entertaining the guests, but it's just a perverse prelude to what comes next.
The atmosphere at these events, the sources, the eyewitness accounts describe it as toxic. Utterly toxic. You have these powerful men sitting around, maybe sipping tea, watching these young boys dance, but the reports really underscore the intent. You can feel it. They specifically mention the look in the viewer's eyes, describing it as evil. It just reflects the predatory reason they're all there.
And that leads right into this cruel cycle of commerce, because the boy is selected right there at the party. Often, a powerful man will bid money for him, almost like an auction item, or he'll just use his authority, his power, to claim the child for his sexual needs. And what follows isn't a one-time thing. It's a continuous, horrifying pipeline of exploitation. Understanding this is crucial because it literally turns these boys into tradable commodities.
An entire economy built on abuse. It's staggering. After the initial pickup, they're not just kept by one man. They face repeated physical abuse, torture, and they're regularly shared. That's the term used. Meaning they're transferred, loaned out, sometimes resold to other commanders, other powerful figures.
Exactly. It's a system ensuring continuous degradation, continuous profit for the abusers. And this brutal pipeline can go on for years. The child moves from one abuser to the next until they're just physically and mentally destroyed.
The scale. You mentioned the scale. It's hard to even grasp.
It's absolutely staggering. And this is where the documentation gets really difficult. We know thousands of cases have been officially reported, documented by human rights groups and others. But research suggests the true number. The undocumented cases, the hidden ones across these war-torn regions, it could be millions. The tragedy is likely far, far deeper than any official record can capture.
And the victims themselves, who are they? The sources paint this devastating picture of just pure innocence, boys sometimes as young as 7 or 8, maybe even younger, children who, as one source put it, don't even know how the world works. Utterly powerless against men who command police forces, militias, armies.
And we have to talk about the families, too. Their terrible situation. The documents we studied often connect this practice directly to the grinding poverty, the starvation that grips huge parts of Afghanistan. Sometimes families are complicit, yes, selling their sons out of sheer economic desperation, feeling like they have no other choice, trading a child's life so the rest of the family might survive. It's horrific.
But it's not always selling, is it?
No, not always. A significant number of boys are simply seized, forcibly taken by warlords who are completely untouchable. So you see this devastating choice families face. Complicity out of absolute necessity, or just utter helplessness against raw, militarized power.
Okay, so to really understand why this practice is so resilient, why it keeps coming back, we need to look at its history, right?
Yeah.
It's often called a tradition, and the sources confirm these roots go back centuries.
Oh yes, way back. What's fascinating, in a grim way, is tracing it to the 13th century. There's strong evidence in historical Persian and Central Asian cultures, and back then, it wasn't necessarily hidden. In that early context, having these young male companions was often treated as a very visible status symbol for rulers, for wealthy merchants.
That's a really important point. It wasn't just about sexual exploitation, although that was often part of it. It was also a public declaration. Look how rich and powerful I am. I can afford to maintain and display this expensive possession.
Yeah.
Who was also, a companion and an entertainer. That historical link between the practice and high status is key to understanding it now.
Exactly. The practice kind of faded in and out with different political changes, but it saw this major aggressive resurgence in the 1980s. This was during the Soviet-Afghan War. The various mujahideen factions were gaining power, wealth, territory, and they needed new ways to show off their supremacy, their dominance over each other.
Right. In the chaos of war, normal rules break down and displays of power get more brutal. So warlords started explicitly using these boys again, adopting the old practice to showcase their power, their status among their peers.
Precisely. It became this sort of perverse military entitlement, a display of spoils, of untouchable authority.
Which explains why it's so deeply embedded culturally. It doesn't just vanish when a government changes, it adapts.
Right. And interestingly, when the Taliban first took power in the mid-90s, they officially banned Bacha Bazi. They cited it as un-Islamic, contradicting Sharia law.
And they enforced that ban brutally, didn't they? For a while, it was forced underground, though maybe not totally gone.
Correct. But then came the next big shift, the 2001 U.S. invasion and the quick removal of the Taliban regime. That created this massive power vacuum, especially at the local level.
And in that vacuum,
the tradition surfaced again, as the sources put it. Why? Because it's tied to local power, money, military authority, not necessarily ideology. When the U.S.-backed government came in, it had to rely heavily on regional commanders, former warlords, many of whom were neck-deep in Bacha Bazi.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so that reliance inadvertently protected the abusers. It allowed the tradition to just bloom again.
Which brings us to its modern legal status, which sounds completely contradictory. Nominally, it's illegal, right? Multiple Afghan governments have said so. But laws on paper don't mean much without enforcement.
That's the absolute critical disconnect. We have reports describing how the commerce around Bacha Bazi operates right out in the open. Videos of the performances, CDs of the boys dancing in those feminine clothes. You can find them sold openly in markets in some areas.
Seriously?
In the open market, yes. This blatant, open commercialization of abuse, despite the law. It just highlights the total failure of the justice system and the pervasive corruption that lets perpetrators operate without any fear of arrest, any fear of prosecution. The whole system seems designed to just look the other way.
We keep coming back to this idea, impunity. It's the core of it. The question isn't just who is doing it, but how they get away with it. How do they sustain kidnapping, sexual slavery in a region that's had so much international attention?
The answer really is structural power. It's that simple and that complicated. These warlords, these powerful officials, they effectively exist above the law because in their areas, they are the law. The sources describe a reality where if you have power, you can do anything. And this impunity is helped by a few things. First, a justice system that's either collapsed or totally corrupt, refusing to even hear cases against powerful men. Second, deep complicity within the security forces themselves.
Let's talk about the police involvement, because that's just devastating in the reports. The police, who are supposed to protect kids and enforce the supposed ban, are often not just complicit, but actually participating.
Exactly. It's horrific. Local police chiefs, commanders, they're often abusers themselves. Or they report directly to the warlords who run the whole practice. So if a family somehow finds the courage to try and report the abuse, what happens? They're dismissed, they're intimidated, they get direct threats from the police.
So the very institution meant to protect is part of the threat.
It solidifies the power structure. The child has absolutely nowhere to turn. The power broker has this institutional shield. The abuse continues because the state's own infrastructure is co-opted by the abusers.
But this horrific cycle, it does eventually end for the individual child, right? They're not in a good way. It depends on their appearance.
Yes, the abuse typically ends for the boys only when they lose that perceived innocence, that feminine look. This usually happens around age 18. As they mature, maybe grow facial hair, look more physically masculine, they become undesirable to the warlords. They're no longer the specific commodity the practice demands.
And once they hit that age, they're just discarded, cruelly. The sources paint a really grim picture of what happens next. After spending their entire adolescence traumatized, what paths are even open to them?
Very few, and they're devastating. The trauma is comprehensive. First, they face intense social stigma. In a conservative society, they're often seen not as victims, but as tainted, corrupted, damaged goods.
So even escaping the abuse doesn't mean freedom?
Not at all. The limited paths forward usually involve drug addiction, often as a way to just cope with the trauma, or being forced into general prostitution simply to survive, or getting permanently stuck in this broader cycle of crime and trauma. Their lives have been stolen. Their ability to fit into normal society, get a job, form healthy relationships, it's often permanently destroyed.
The people documenting this describe it as a curse that destroys an entire generation. That phrase really sticks. It's not just one life ruined, it's systemic. It ruins a whole group of young men, pushes them to the absolute margins of society, often into ongoing crime, making sure the suffering continues long after the specific sexual abuse stops.
And to really grasp the weight of that curse, we can look at the psychological assessments. The Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission, the AIHRC, has documented this. Their findings confirm just how severe the psychological damage is for these victims.
The trauma sounds incredibly complex, crippling. They report suffering from major levels of deep-seated distrust, which makes sense, right? If the people who should protect you, family, police, are involved or complicit, who can you possibly trust?
Exactly. And that distrust makes any later attempt at recovery, at social integration, almost impossible.
And alongside that distrust, overwhelming depression, a chronic sense of hopelessness, feeling like your future is just gone.
Yes, profound hopelessness. And the AIHRC reports also flag something really alarming. The development of intense feelings of revenge, the sheer brutality, the relentlessness of the abuse, it cultivates this inner rage, this desire for retribution, which tragically often comes out later as criminal activity or violence. It completes the cycle of trauma and turns them into permanent outcasts.
The sources also included survivor testimony, which is just vital. It makes these statistics painfully real. One survivor talked about being abducted, beaten, and shared, literally passed around like property between warlords for years.
He described how those years of forced dancing, the constant sexual abuse, it fundamentally broke his grasp on reality. His own words were heartbreaking. "I lost my mind." He talked about perpetual psychological problems. He even mentioned physical signs of distress, saying something like, "My nails all the time, I have psychological problem," showing how the trauma manifested physically.
And the aftermath for him sounds exactly like the grim paths you described. Once discarded, he fell into deep drug addiction, severe depression, his entire life just completely derailed by the time he was 18. And you multiply that specific tragedy by thousands, you see the absolute systemic destruction Bacha Bazi causes, creating a generation of men who are just fundamentally broken by the most powerful people in their society.
And it's important to realize, too, that this trauma warps the local idea of masculinity. These boys, forced into feminine roles, subjected to sexual violence. They often struggle deeply later on to fit into traditional male roles in a very conservative culture, which isolates them even further, pushing them toward the only social structures left: crime, addiction. It's a vicious cycle.
Now, inevitably, a human rights violation this massive spills onto the world stage. It sparks debate and recently a lot of online outrage. Our sources mention, for instance, widespread social media activity like tweets in March 2025 where Bacha Bazi suddenly became a global trending topic.
Yes, but the question we have to analyze, based on the reports, is how effective is that distant digital outrage? The sources question it directly. Will this save a child's life in Afghanistan?
Right.
Awareness is crucial. It's the first step, absolutely. But there's this huge gap geographically and politically, between a viral hashtag in, say, New York and actual intervention in a remote Afghan province. The pressure from social media often just bounces off these entrenched, armed power brokers.
And then there's the really complex, often controversial issue of connecting this cultural practice to religion. We saw comments in the sources like a user named Jellicos trying to paint Bacha Bazi as a product of Islamic countries.
Right, and this is where clarification based purely on the evidence is so important. Our sources consistently state that Bacha Bazi is overwhelmingly a cultural practice. It's tied to historical Persian traditions, made worse by warlordism, poverty. It is explicitly not a religious practice. In fact, mainstream Islamic law jurisprudence widely considers this kind of exploitation and abuse haram, strictly forbidden.
So the nuance is key.
Crucial. It's a culturally powerful criminal practice thriving within a predominantly Muslim country. But the drivers are power, history, desperation, not religious doctrine itself.
And what makes this story even more damning is the documented international complicity. This happened while foreign forces were in Afghanistan, right? Specifically between 2000 and 2010.
Yes. During that decade, foreign forces, including thousands of U.S. soldiers, were acutely aware of Bacha Bazi. They knew it was happening. Detailed reports were filed, documenting the practice, sometimes directly involving commanders the U.S. was allied with.
Directly involving their allies.
Yes. But here's where tactical priorities just overruled morality. Foreign forces were explicitly told not to intervene.
They were told not to intervene, even knowing children were being abused.
Correct. Intervention was avoided because the very commanders and officials the foreign military relied on, their essential Afghan allies, were the perpetrators.
Oh my God.
The relationship was seen as too important, too critical to the mission, to risk over protecting children. The source gives this devastating quote from a soldier on the ground who confirmed the policy. "We were told to look the other way."
Look the other way, while children were being systematically abused by their allies.
It's a profound moral compromise and blatant political hypocrisy. Countries preaching human rights prioritize short-term military goals over protecting the most vulnerable people they encountered.
And that deliberate ignorance, it did more than just let it continue, didn't it?
It essentially rubber-stamped the warlords' impunity. It sent a clear signal. Your power goes beyond international scrutiny. That failure severely damaged any chance of real reform, of accountability in the years that followed.
Okay, let's fast forward to now. Post-2022, the Taliban are back in control. The international community has largely cut aid, cut cooperation.
And that cutoff of international aid has had this catastrophic secondary effect on the victims. The few support systems that did exist, maybe some rehabilitation centers trying to help Bacha Bazi survivors with trauma, addiction they've been forced to shut down, no funding.
So the lifeline is gone.
Completely gone.
Yeah.
This withdrawal of support leaves the thousands of boys who managed to escape the cycle with absolutely nowhere to turn for psychological help, for medical help. Their trauma effectively becomes a life sentence.
And what about the Taliban's current stance? They've claimed, again, to ban the practice, citing Sharia law. But is it working?
Well, their enforcement capacity, especially against powerful local figures, seems deeply questionable. Warlords still hold immense local power. They have money, they have weapons caches. They continue Bacha Bazi in private parties in remote areas, effectively ignoring couples' edicts.
So, same old story, power trumps law.
The sources suggest that's the practical reality. They're just too strong to be challenged effectively. And there's also the unsettling possibility, maybe, that the ban is enforced selectively.
Yeah.
Or perhaps not even truly desired by all parts of the ruling structure, given how deeply tangled the practice is with these powerful figures.
So, pulling all this together, it's synthesizing what we've unpacked today. Bacha Bazi feels like this historical nightmare that just keeps going, because it sits perfectly at the intersection of three almost immovable forces: deep cultural tradition, crushing poverty that makes families desperate, and most powerfully, total impunity granted by local military-level power structures.
It really does starkly illustrate the complete helplessness of the victims. These are children caught between forces they have no chance against. Warlords with private armies on one side and an international community that, when it had the chance, prioritized geopolitical convenience over their safety.
The core tragic problem seems to be that these local power structures in Afghanistan are just too strong, too well-armed, too resistant to any kind of change, external or internal, which is why this deep dive, which we undertook to make sure this dark practice is documented, known globally, it has to confront the limits of awareness itself.
Exactly. We have to ask ourselves, what level of global awareness is actually enough when practical intervention seems politically, logistically impossible? We know the truth now. Thanks to years of reporting, documented military failures, we know. Yet the nightmare continues for children whose only crime is their vulnerability.
The final thought we're left with, and it's a provocative one, stems directly from that international complicity we discussed. Given that powerful nations claiming a moral mandate for intervention, knew about this systemic child abuse, documented it, and then actively chose to look the other way for tactical gain. We have to confront where that leaves us now.
Are we now, as distant observers who know this truth, truly just bystanders? Or are we, in a way, tacitly perpetuating that historical failure of global morality? Simply by acknowledging the devastating facts but remaining distant, unable, or maybe unwilling to bridge that gap between awareness and any kind of functional support for the victims. The sources are clear on one thing. Until the powerful structures protecting the abusers are genuinely broken, the ruins of Bacha Bazi will continue to define the fate of far too many of Afghanistan's children.